But I want to start with DOGE, if you don't mind. The Department of Government Efficiency, something that the president certainly has the right to make, just like Kennedy made USAID back in 1961, wasn't an act of Congress. And DOGE simply is going to go through and find out where the waste is. Elon Musk is alleging there might be $750 billion in waste every single year in the United States government. And the left's lies are Elon Musk is trying to get rid of your Social Security, your Medicaid, your Medicare, and any other benefit that people would have. He's doing it because he's rich and hates people. So how do you combat the lies that he's an unelected guy that doesn't have the right to do this with the truth that he's just trying to make sure that our taxpayer dollars are accounted for?
Well, first of all the bureaucrats in those agencies, many of them, leftist partisans that in the first Trump administration did everything they could to undermine and sabotage his administration, they are also unelected. They also withhold information from Congress. So even though we have the constitutional authority to do oversight investigation, they don't give us the information. So it takes a president using his executive authority inside the executive branch to go ferret out the information. So from my standpoint, I'd much rather have an unelected individual who's a genius, who has shown that he knows how to squeeze every inefficiency out of, for example, a space launch.
Yes.
Okay. That understands computer systems, who's recruited some just crack young people. And let's face it, when I set up a computer, I don't do it. I need a young person to do that. Going inside these agencies, and it's amazing how much they found already. This is just the tip of the iceberg. And by the way, $750 billion is a lowball estimate. Joe, in 2019, the federal government spent $4.4 trillion. Then COVID hit, we went to $6.6 trillion.
Wow. For
5 years, we averaged 6.5. Now, the analogy I use, if you're a family, you have an illness, let's say you have to spend, borrow $50,000 for medical expenses. If you get well, you don't keep borrowing $50,000 and spend that level.
Yes.
You quit borrowing, you return to your normal baseline of spending. That's not what the federal government did. So now last year we spent about 6.9. We're on continuing resolution, so we'll spend about the same amount this year, around $7 trillion, from 4.4 to $7 trillion. It's 60% more. There's no justification for that. There's way more than $750 billion of abuse and waste and fraud and just things that, are not productive, other than they're very productive at devaluing the dollar, causing inflation, making it very difficult to get by on your old salary.
Well, thank you for telling us about it, because I think the government, by and large, has been lying, especially the left, because they haven't said that we haven't gone back to pre-COVID spending. They actually have alleged that much of the spending has gone back to pre-COVID. I had no idea that it was almost $7 trillion last year, and we're on pace to do the same thing this year. So when you've got somebody in there who's willing to take away the money from these unelected bureaucrats like USAID, which is $38 billion a year, and they tell you, a senator, and me, a citizen, I'm not allowed to ask them where they're spending that. They told the Secretary of State, we don't have to answer to you. There is no oversight. We're an independent agency. Can President Trump, just like Kennedy did to create it, can he eliminate it with a swipe of his pen?
That's probably an open question. Yeah, Congress can. And so, Joe, here's how I'm approaching the budget. And this is unique. It's actually gaining some traction. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal and published on January 2nd talking about returning to pre-pandemic levels. Okay, what base do you use? So I've given my colleagues options. And I'll actually show you, pull it out right here. Here's a detailed budget. This is using Obama's 2014 spending, if you can see that, right?
Yes.
And if you take Obama's 2014 spending, which, by the way, I don't think we spent too little, right?
Right.
And you increase it based on population growth and inflation, exempt Social Security and Medicare. You use Biden's 2025 Social Security, Medicare, and interest expense.
Okay.
Today we'd be spending $6.2 trillion versus the $7 trillion we're spending. If you go back to 1998, Bill Clinton, again, I don't think he was spending too little. That, by the way, passed broad bipartisan support.
Yes.
Susan Collins voted for that. Mitch McConnell voted for that. Chuck Grassley voted for that. John Thune voted for that. Lindsey Graham voted for that. Plus Durbin and Schumer, all these guys, okay? If you do the same thing, increase that by population and inflation, use today's Social Security, Medicare, and interest, that's $5.5 trillion. The reason that's so intriguing, that's what we're expected to gain in revenue this year. If we would go back to Bill Clinton's spending priorities, inflate those, population, inflation, slot in today's Social Security, Medicare, and interest, we would have a balanced budget. That's how reasonable, that's how we could do it. We could do this, and yet when I show this to my colleagues, they just,
Yeah.
"No, that's not possible." It's as close to zero-based budgeting as we're going to get. I'm not going back to zero. I'm going back to 5.5 trillion, and we'll build it up from that. If you don't have enough defense spending, fine, add to it. But we still, at a minimum, we should be reducing federal government spending by $1 trillion. But I don't like talking about that way. I don't want to accept the premise that we start at 7 trillion, then cut. No, let's start by a reasonably plussed up baseline of 5.5 trillion. If you got to add to it, fine. I'm a reasonable guy. Again, I cannot tell you what I'm pushing against, the mountain I'm trying to climb
Right.
to get my colleagues to accept that premise.
Well, that's the thing, Ron. I mean, historically, again, it's U.S. Senator Ron Johnson, great state of Wisconsin. Go to ronjohnson.senate.gov. Follow him everywhere on social media, too. That's the problem. Once the government takes the money, it never gives it back. And I give this very, very simple example. The New York State Thruway was built, and the New York residents were told, we need to get a toll from you to build it. Once we build it and we pay for the building, the tolls go away. Well, of course, as soon as the tolls were going to go away, they doubled the tolls, and they said, no, we need it for maintenance now. Once you give the government the money, they're never going to take it away. So is there a way to hardline this and say, we've got to go back to pre-COVID, then we can add to it what we need, like you just said? Is there any sort of traction to do something like that?
Yeah, it is gaining traction. So Lindsey Graham, chair of our budget committee, announced we're going to mark up a budget. We're going to base it not on Obama or Clinton. What we're going to do is base it on Trump's own budget for 2025. So we're using his spending projections when he did put in his last budget. Plus, we're using Biden's Social Security, Medicare, and interest. That comes in about $6.62 trillion. That is what I believe we're going to base our budget for our first reconciliation package to provide the funding for border security and for some defense. So that's again. Now, how do you ensure that we continue on that baseline for future reconciliation for fiscal year 2026? Again, the devil will be in the details. There's a long road. It's going to be a tough slog, but it'd be nice to establish that as a reasonable baseline of spending, and then start fighting over how do we stay within those limits.
Well, what if Musk and Doge find $1 trillion? That's waste. So that would come off of what you're predicting now. Would it be 5.2 trillion? Can we go there?
Well, again, what I tried to explain in conference lunch today is if you're a business, and let's say you lose a big account,
okay,
you got to cut your budget. I mean, what you could do is go to one department and say, we're eliminating you. Probably the more palatable and smarter thing to do is go to all the departments and say, okay, I want you all to cut 5% of your budget. And that'd be a reasonable thing to do. That's by in effect what I'm doing. It's not across the board cut, but I'm just saying go back, 4, 5 years, 10 years, 20 some years, take that budget, increase it based on population growth and inflation. Again, use Social Security and Medicare as it is today, interest expense, it is what it is, and start from that base. Now take a look at the numbers. This is 6,000 lines of detail here. Okay, this is all the spending little categories, mandatory, discretionary. And I've been walking around with this thing. I don't have a colleague that's really, hey, let me see the detail, okay?
Right.
But it exists. It's possible. It's doable. It's a good base. It's a good baseline to, again, at some point in time, somebody fills in the detail. Generally, who fills in the detail, some staff member, again, an unelected staff member. It's about time that elected officials take responsibility and look at the detail. And you justify to me why we should be $7 trillion as opposed to 5.5 and balancing the budget.